Thank you, Katie and Nora. We'll have questions at the end at the table. It's now my pleasure to introduce Tess Hamilton to the podium. Tess is an assistant conservator of contemporary art in the Department of Photograph Conservation. She works with Nora and Katie. She conducted the research that she's presenting today while on a fellowship at the Guggenheim, the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum. She was the Robert Mapplethorpe Foundation Fellow in Photograph Conservation. She will be presenting together with Jeffrey is not here. Jeffrey is a co-author of this paper. And Jeffrey is a senior conservator of paper and photograph at the Guggenheim Museum. And Cynthia Yu, who is here and will be co-presenting with Tess, is a data analyst at the Lens Media Lab at the Institute of Preservation of Cultural Heritage here at Yale University. They're going to be talking about their research on the characterization of Mapplethorpe prints at the Guggenheim. Tess?
So hi, everyone. I just want to start by saying how honored I am to be able to speak here on behalf of the Guggenheim today. And my co-author, Jeffrey Warda, is very bummed that he couldn't make it. This work is very much the culmination of over 10 years of work that absolutely would not have been possible without him. We also want to say how profoundly indebted we are to Paul and to the Lens Media Lab for doing this with us. They were just absolutely instrumental, and their role in us understanding this collection really can't be understated. So Robert Mapplethorpe and the Robert Mapplethorpe Foundation have been extremely important to the Guggenheim as an institution. In 1993, the foundation gave a groundbreaking gift to the museum, which included 193 Robert Mapplethorpe works, as well as the funding to establish a position of curator of photography, which is now held by Jennifer Blessing. Guggenheim then named one of its tower galleries, the Robert Mapplethorpe Gallery, and in this slide you can see some of the artist's work in that space. And this collection is this really amazing resource to understand Mapplethorpe's career overall. It includes works from every single year of his career and a very broad range of media that he worked in, including in sculpture, collage, Polaroid, and both unique and editioned photographic prints, some of which are in handmade frames. And in 2019, the Guggenheim celebrated this collection with the show Implicit Tensions, Mapplethorpe Now, which is curated by Lauren Hinkson. The exhibition was done in two parts. So the first part showed Mapplethorpe prints from the collection, and the second showed Mapplethorpe in conversation with artists who were influenced by or responded to his influence on the history of photography. This included Lyle Ashton Harris, Glenn Ligon, Zanele Muholi, Paul Sepuya, Rodemi Fani-Coyote, and Catherine Opie. And beyond the show, the gift of Mapplethorpe work was really crucial to the Guggenheim even collecting photography at all. So before this gift from the foundation and before the establishment of the curatorial area, the Guggenheim didn't collect photography. And since then, it has become our fastest growing collection area in the museum. We have an emphasis on contemporary photography and have quite a few artists who use photographic portraiture to explore identity, especially queer identities. Mapplethorpe's influence really pervades the whole collection, including a gift in the late 90s of George Platt Lyne's photographs, who's an artist, a predecessor to Mapplethorpe, who was hugely influential on his career, as well as large bodies of works by later artists and contemporaries of Mapplethorpe, like Catherine Opie, Lyle Ashton Harris, and Rodemi Fani-Coyote. There's also artists in the collection who were responding directly to Mapplethorpe's work and legacy, including Glenn Ligon. In this piece, Notes on the Margin of the Black Book. In his piece, Ligon disbound and framed pages from Mapplethorpe's 1986 publication, The Black Book, and paired the images with text commentaries from a variety of sources like evangelical preachers, philosophers, activists, artists, authors, some of whom were queer Black men, some of whom were not, to show just the wide range of different responses to these idealized, erotic, and objectifying photographs of Black men. And this piece is interesting because today we're here talking about photographs as objects. Ligon's not interested in that at all in this piece. He's focused on the affect of imagery and kind of the colonial histories of image making that influenced much of Mapplethorpe's aesthetic and work. and those influence on the interconnection between self and culture and sex desire and race. But with this rapidly growing and very diverse collection of photography, the Guggenheim worked with Paul Messier over a period of about 10 years plus to care for the collection, including the Mapplethorpe prints. This led to a preliminary characterization of the 20 Mapplethorpe platinum-palladium prints in the collection by Jeffrey Warda, Paul Messier, and Jennifer McGlinchey-Sexton in 2016-ish. So these Mapplethorpe's platinum prints are exquisite. They're beautiful. They're meticulously crafted, and they just really reflect Mapplethorpe's relationship to materiality. Mapplethorpe thought about photography as something sculptural, and unlike Man Ray, he cared very, very deeply about the material nature of his prints. He often spoke about how much he cherished all of the opportunities he had to study unglazed photographs at the Met and through Sam Wagstaff's private collection. And so he was also, he was very meticulous, but he was also very adventurous in his materials, and he explored a wide range of printing processes, all of which are reflected in the Guggenheim's collection. So, he's most well known for his silver gelatin prints, like the one of Patti Smith, but he also made quite a few unique prints in handmade frames and worked with dye transfer, Polaroid, Cibachrome sculpture, and collage. And because of the breadth and the depth of this collection, Jeffrey and Paul recognized its potential for a larger characterization study. Then in 2019, the Robert Mapplethorpe Foundation provided the funding to establish an endowed fellowship in conservation, providing the opportunity to do this study, and that is where I came in. So I was the inaugural photograph conservation fellow at the Guggenheim. I worked there for a much too brief 2-year period, and had the tremendous opportunity to do the data collection and some of the preliminary characterization for this work. So of the 193 works in the collection, we identified 185 that could be included in the study, a total of 191 prints. And in addition to the kind of standard gloss, color, texture, and thickness measurements that is part of the kind of Lens Media Lab protocol, we added a few other metrics. So we did X-ray XRF to look for selenium toning in prints, as well as did a condition assessment and a documentation of all the inscriptions on each print. And this data collection was relatively straightforward, but given some of the unique aspects of the collection, we had to modify a few things. So thickness measurements are typically taken with a micrometer. Almost all of our prints were flush mounted to mat boards, so that made a micrometer absolutely useless. What we ended up doing was taking the microscope camera that's used to take texture images, turning it on its side, pointing it at the edge of the print through a little scale bar, and lighting it from the back, which is what you see on the left, to take these micrographs and measure from those, which you see one of on the right. And this was actually a great opportunity because it let us see discoloration in the dry mount material and the mat board that we wouldn't have otherwise noticed. In addition to characterization, like I said, we documented all the inscriptions on the backs of prints, checked for accuracy on our data in TMS, something that we hadn't had the time or staff to do since the 1990s acquisition. This was a great opportunity. It revealed a lot of discrepancies in date, title, and edition number, and has opened up quite a few avenues of research for our curator, Jenny Blessing, and curatorial fellow, Victoria Horrocks. So taking measurements on this number of work or this collection this size is quite a big undertaking, since each data point represents 3 to 5 measurements averaged. So it ended up being like over 5,000 color measurements and like 1,000 gloss and thickness. Last week, Cynthia completed some of the initial analysis of the data, and it's already starting to reveal some really interesting information about Mapplethorpe's career and his use of materials. So, for example, Mapplethorpe often spoke about having these really distinct categories in his work, or subject matters in his work, and they were still life, sex, and portraiture. And when he would do publications, he would often group his work together according to these subject matters. But at the same time, he would often say how, I treat all of the subjects I shoot the same. I'm trying to transcend subject and find perfection in form. He really looked at everything in this very sculptural way. And hopefully you can see from these two, portrait and sex photograph, that there's the lines between these subject matters often very blurry. And it can be really difficult to categorize Mapplethorpe photographs by subject matter. In 1978, in an interview, Mapplethorpe said, I use Ilford's semi-matte for portraits because I like how it renders skin texture. But I really prefer Bravara glossy paper for sex images because it's shiny and it gets this slick black surface and slick surface and rich blacks. So we were curious to see if that actually holds true across the course of his career. And when we look at the clustering, so how prints sort of fall based on their paper characteristics, you see that it's not true. We have many portraits that are on very glossy paper, many sex photographs that are on very matte paper. And the boundaries within the material, much like the subject matter itself, tends to be more fluid. Another pattern we're curious in is how Mapplethorpe's materials changed based on his collaborators. While Mapplethorpe was very much a perfectionist, he was also deeply, deeply collaborative in his work, with his models and his sitters, also with his studio assistants, art directors, and the wide range of printmakers that he worked with. Because Mapplethorpe cared so deeply about materials, he chose not to print himself. He worked with professional printmakers that he knew could make the absolute best prints and get the results that he demanded from his own work. So an example of the differences that arise across printmakers comes from the pilot study that Jeffrey, Paul, and Jen did on the platinum prints. So here are two platinum prints from both the late 1980s. Mapplethorpe worked with two different people, Martin Axon, who you can see in the self-portrait on the left, and Sal Lopes, who printed the self-portrait on the right. Again, these prints are gorgeous. You can't even see how gorgeous they are on the screen. They're just amazing. But they're also quite different from one another. So when you look at the texture images, the Sal Lopes prints are on this very, very uniquely rough Arches paper, whereas the Axon prints are on this somewhat smoother Fabriano paper. And when you look at the glyphs, which here are sorted according from least to most expressive and color-coded by year, you see that these do start to group according to printer. So all of these pink ones, the later prints, are all the Lopes prints, whereas these are all the Axon prints, a little bit less expressive up here. Also from that preliminary study, you can see that there's a clear elemental difference between these two printers. So Martin Axon was using significantly more platinum, as well as using lead in his prints, while Lopes is using much less platinum and no lead. And then when you look at Mapplethorpe's career over time, you also see some really clear trends within his work as he matured as an artist. This is particularly most true for his unique works. So in this graph, you see expressiveness on the y-axis, and the date on the x-axis, and then print type is colored, or print medium is color-coded. And so you can see in his earliest work, which are like unique Polaroids before he got his Hasselblad and started working more solely in photography, these Polaroids are very unexpressive. They're very cool, they're very glossy. And so, early on he's using these unexpressive papers, but he's also, putting them often in unique frames or constructions or making them into these very expressive sculptural objects. And then by the end of his career, when he has the means and the opportunity to make whatever kind of print he wants, he's choosing these extremely expressive techniques from the 19th century, like platinum-palladium printing and photogravure. Often these kind of are falling outside of the range of more expressive than gelatin silver can even achieve. He's always been interested in sculpture, and you see towards the end of the career, he's figured out a way to maybe combine this sculptural interest into the paper itself. And that's in contrast to the gelatin silver prints that you see in orange, which remain pretty consistent throughout his career within this sort of middle range of expressiveness. And, these are the prints that Mapplethorpe was arguably the most famous for. And they act as this very consistent through line. These are the addition to prints that really sustained him throughout his life and allowed him to achieve these later explorations in 19th century techniques that he's doing in the 80s. And then, while the gelatin silver prints are relatively consistent, there's always exceptions and unexpected materials when you're looking at, someone's in a large body of work over the course of someone's lifetime. So for example, we have these 12 unique 30 by 30 prints, 30 inch by 30 inch prints that are unlike the others. They are printed to the margins. They're made over a long course of time. Some are toned, some are not, some are warm, some are cool. So we're hoping that when we get a more granular analysis of the data, we'll be able to maybe piece together the relationship among these prints and maybe figure out their context or what they were made for. Among some of Mapplethorpe's very early works from the 70s, are a group of unique gelatin silver prints, all of which are in handmade artist frames. They're all on this very interesting kind of pebbly textured paper. So we're also hoping to see that paper's relationship to the larger Lens Media Lab collection. And so this analysis also afforded me a chance to look very closely at the resin-coated prints in the collection, which there's 4 of. And I'm going to I spoke about this component of the research at AIC. I'm going to touch on it much more briefly here. So these papers are interesting among the Mapplethorpe collection because they're the only ones on resin-coated paper. And they're also really interesting in the larger ecosystem of resin-coated paper because of some of the additives in the polyethylene layer. And I wouldn't have seen these things without doing this characterization study, and it allowed me to use the Lens Media Lab collection in a very different way. So when we think about resin-coated paper, we think of this very simple model of a paper core between 2 layers of polyethylene, the top one toned with titanium dioxide, and then gelatin emulsion silver image material on top. Of course, this material is actually much more complex. It's not just polyethylene, it's polyolefin. There's a wide range of chain lengths and side chains in that plastic. And then each layer has a number of additives like antioxidants, lubricants, fillers, colorants, preservatives, et cetera, et cetera. So, these manufactured papers are much more complex. And so, when I was collecting texture data for this project, when I looked at these prints under the microscope, I saw the titanium dioxide layer isn't just white. It actually has quite a bit of color in it other than white. So you can see quite a few blue particles, as well as a significant amount of magenta. And when we saw this, we were like, oh, that's weird. Let's look at it under UV. So this is the print in its housing. We house everything in phototext tissue and then 10-ply folder stock and then in drawers. And when you look at it in its housing, you can see that the optical brighteners are starting to transfer onto the housing material. And this is much more pronounced on the back. And so these prints, since they've been put in this housing, have been stored in perfect conditions. There's been no fluctuation in humidity. They're monitored. There's been no exposure to moisture. So this isn't because of solubility of OBAs. It's happening because of a dry transfer. And I was able to confirm that by rubbing a non-optically brightened cotton swab on the back of the print very gently. And you can see that that fluorescent material is just readily transferring off. So I was curious if these characteristics were unique to these papers or if there's something that is seen much more broadly in resin-coated papers. So I came down here to West Haven to look at the Lens Media Lab collection of papers, specifically at resin-coated papers. I was able to look at 80 paper samples from between 1970 and 2002 from a wide range of manufacturers. This is not comprehensive to all the RC papers in the collection. It's what I could look at based on time constraints. Looking under the microscope, 79 of the 80 had blue colorants in it, but only 35 had magenta. And when I removed chromogenic papers from this grouping and only looked at gelatin silver, you can see that the papers with magenta is pretty restricted to Kodak in the 1970s and then tapering off into the 1980s. And that's exactly the range that these Mapplethorpe prints fall into, and we know they're Kodak from the back printing. When you look at the micrographs of these papers, so these are non-Kodak papers, luminous and oriental, you can see, there's some small blue particles, some cloudy blue in the luminous. It's really visually distinct from the Kodak papers, which have a significantly higher amount of colorant as well as that magenta. So this is Kodak Polycontrast RC and Kodak Kodabrome RC from the 70s. When you look at those same papers from the 80s, you can see that they're visually distinct. They've lost most of that colorant. There's almost no magenta. They've really changed in that 10-year period. So if a much more systematic study was conducted of these RC papers and their differences, they might provide another metric to begin, aid in the dating and identification of resin-coated paper bases. I also looked at all of these papers under ultraviolet radiation to look for the presence of optically brightened. 76 of them were optically brightened, and of that, 24 exhibited transfer when rubbed with a dry swab. There's much less clear of a pattern between manufacturer and time frame, and this just kind of shows that OBA exudation is a type of inherent bias in some resin-coated papers, and it needs to be considered during treatment and rehousing. So just to conclude, when you look at such a large collection of a single artist, when you're just looking, you might observe patterns or variations in the work, And you might be able to correlate these to observations or moments in the artist's career, something they said in an interview, but always it's going to be, just an observation. It's going to be very speculative. And going through this collection using the Lens Media Lab protocol, you're able to support or sometimes challenge these observations in a new way, and it just lets us better articulate what we're seeing and expand on what we think we might know about something that is as monumentous and complex as an entire lifetime of work. What's more, the study afforded us, or really forced us, to do the work of close looking, which is a privilege that is much too rarely afforded to us, and was needed to make some of these discoveries about materials, like the resin-coated papers. In talking about his own work, Mapplethorpe once said, I took these pictures, or they were taken because I hadn't seen pictures like that before. That's why one makes what one makes, because you want to see something you haven't seen before. In some ways, that's kind of what we're all trying to do with this type of work. It's this close, meticulous looking and study of materials to show something that we haven't seen before, or more importantly, to show something we haven't seen before, and to really understand the true breadth and depth of our material culture and cultural history, one print and one artist at a time. So huge thanks to Lens Media Lab and the Guggenheim, and of course, the Robert Mapplethorpe Foundation, and to all of you for listening.